Hello everybody, thank you for coming back to the channel. In this video, we are going to cover Cypress.js. And Cypress.js is a JavaScript testing framework that allows us to test our web applications. And I've been recently using Cypress and I have really been favoring it over other testing frameworks. And let me quickly tell you the reasons why. So the first reason is that it's super easy to set up, and we're gonna see how easy it is to set up in a moment. Another thing is that it's really fast. So it's actually a lot faster to execute your tests over other testing frameworks. Another thing that's really important to me is that it's super easy to debug. One problem with tests is you can't really visualize the changes, and so it actually gets really hard to debug and figure out exactly why your tests are failing. With Cypress, you actually get this really amazing GUI that basically showcases exactly what is going on and what is being tested. So if anything goes wrong in the process, you can quickly catch it and see what it is. And that's what I really love about Cypress, and I know that's what you guys are also going to like about Cypress. And the last thing is you can write all kinds of tests. You can write unit tests, you can write integration tests, and you can write E2E tests with Cypress. So you don't really have to mix and match different testing frameworks. Another thing that I didn't mention here is that it really doesn't depend what you build your application in. So you can build your application in React or Nux or Vue or Angular or Next or just plain HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And you can still test that with Cypress. Whereas before, if you build your app in React, you would probably have to use something like React Testing Library. If you build your application with Nux and Vue, you would use some sort of tailored Vue testing library. But with Cypress, it really doesn't matter what framework you use. As long as it is a web application, you can go ahead and easily test it. And that is really terrific. So we're going to cover Cypress, and to do that, we're going to actually test a bunch of websites that I have already pre-built. So if you want to follow along, please go to my GitHub repo at harblaith7/Cypress crash course and go ahead and clone this repo inside of your local machine. Over here we have two projects, and these are basically the projects that we are going to test. So this is just a basic React project, project 1, and we're just going to basically test it out. We're going to write a bunch of tests using Cypress. So there is no Cypress tests here. We're going to go ahead and add that a little bit later. And then once we're done with project 1, we move on to project 2, which contains a client and a server. And this is just basically a way that we can test HTTP requests. So we're going to cover that as well. And don't worry, if you are ever lost, I have a final version that contains all of the Cypress tests for project 1 and project 2. So if you want to go ahead and follow along, please feel free to clone this repo. You do not have to understand anything that is going on. I built this with React and Express, but if you don't know React and Express, totally fine. All you really have to understand is HTML and basically the DOM model. That's really all you have to understand. So completely fine if you do not understand the code, and we're not really going to be diving into the code that much. We're just going to be testing out our application. All right, so that is super exciting, and I can't wait to see you in the next sections. Let's get right into it and add Cypress to an existing project. Now to do that, what you're going to need to do is, again, clone my repo. And we're going to be starting with project 1 that contains just a simple React application. Again, no need to know any React. Really, all we need to do is know just some of the DOM elements. And I'm going to cover them throughout this crash course. So basically clone this repo and then open it up in any IDE that you want. So I have it over here open in VS Code. I just CD'd into project 1 and I have my simple React app up and running. Now the first thing that you're going to have to do, and let me just quickly zoom in here. The first thing that you have to do is install all of the dependencies. So just do a npm install or a yarn install whatever you want to choose. I suggest just sticking with npm because that's what I'm going to be using throughout the crash course. Now, if you want to choose yarn, just make sure that you are consistent. If you want to use npm, make sure that you're always consistent with npm. So do an npm install, and what that's going to do is just install all of the necessary dependencies. So you should see a node modules folder appear. I'm not going to do it because it takes a long time to do, so I'm not going to go ahead and do it. I already did that. And then what you're going to want to do is just do an npm start to start your application. And what this is going to do is it's going to start our application on localhost 3000. So if we went to localhost 3000, and let me just quickly zoom in here, you can see our application. Now, initially, all you see is this. So you see this like weird side navigation, and then you see this whole empty screen. But if you click on the side nav, you can see here that, okay, we have this first part over here. So this little dashboard, and you can add habits. So this triggers a modal, and you can add whatever habit, and you can toggle habits. Similarly with accomplishments, you can basically add some sort of accomplishment, submit an accomplishment. We have this kind of mock asynchronous request, and there we go. We have a go back page, and then over here we just have a bunch of elements, and I'll talk about exactly why I have this page. Basically, it's used so we can actually learn how we can query for specific elements when we are testing for them. And essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be testing this particular application. So in the elements, we're going to learn how we can query for specific elements. And then for the habit and accomplishment, we're going to be testing a bunch of things. For instance, we're going to be testing, hey, once I click this, a modal appears. Another thing is once I click this, and then I press or add some sort of habit, and then I say save changes, well, that actually renders some sort of card right over here with this text. We're also going to be testing that when I click on a card, the icon changes. And that is pretty much it for this section. And then over here, we're going to be basically testing that you have to input all of the values, and if you don't, you get this error. So that's something that we're going to test. And we're going to test, hey, if you put in all of the necessary errors and you click submit, then we get this loading state, and this is going to simulate asynchronicity. And then over here, we're going to basically test that we get to this landing or this completion page. And then we're also going to be testing that, hey, when I press go back, it goes back to this page and everything is empty and unchecked. So we're just going to be testing a bunch of things, and this is just going to get us used to Cypress. And once you learn these things, you can really easily start testing your own applications. So now let's actually go ahead and install Cypress inside of our app. So to do that, what are we going to do? Well, let's open up our terminal. So let's leave this open right here, our running instance, open up another terminal. And all we're going to do is npm install Cypress. Very, very easily. So we're going to go ahead and install Cypress. This is also a command that takes a little bit of time, but all you really have to do is just npm install Cypress. I believe I already installed it, so I'm just going to quickly cancel it. And just to double check, you should have Cypress installed as a dependency right over here. This is the version that I'm using. If you're using a later version, don't worry. I'm sure the content hasn't changed dramatically. And if it has, maybe I'll post another video and deprecate this one. Okay, cool. So install it for sure. Go through the whole process. I'm just skipping it just for time's sake. Now, let's actually open up a Cypress instance. And when I open up a Cypress instance, what I want you to do is just keep watch. Look at all of the directories over here. So we have our node modules, we have public, we have source, and then we have a bunch of different files. So if we want to open up a Cypress instance, what we do after installing it is npx cypress open. And I want you again to keep watch right over here. Look at these dependencies. So hopefully this doesn't take too long. Okay, so it seems like, okay, it triggers this little GUI right over here. So this is the GUI that I was actually talking about. So it is loading up. But now if I go back here, let's just give it some time. So it seems like it's doing something. Okay, so that took some time, but eventually we got something like this. So you can go ahead and just say, okay, got it. And you can see here that we have a bunch of different tests. So these are just a bunch of tests. And if we want to actually execute and visualize any of these tests, what we do is we basically click on whatever test that we want to execute. So we go ahead, let's say we want to execute this one, actions.spec.js. Well, we would go here and we can see all of the tests. So you can see here that it actually goes to this link right over here. Hopefully this is, let me zoom in a little bit. Maybe that will be better. There we go. Okay, so that's better. Let's actually zoom in one more. So you can see here what's happening is that it's going to this website, this actual website. This is a real website. So you can see here that this is actual website. And what it's doing is it's basically going to this website and then it's performing all of these different actions. So let's actually go ahead and let's re-execute this test. To re-execute this test, what we do is we just retry. And you can see that the GUI that is basically taking place. And as you can see here, step by step, it's showing us what is being done. And this is what I absolutely love about Cypress. And what's great about it is that you can actually go ahead and click on each event and you can see basically a snapshot of that specific event. So let's go over here. Let's actually scroll up a little bit. You can basically, again, see a snapshot of all of the events. You can see here, we're focusing on a specific DOM element. Here, we're blurring it. Let's just continuously click. You can see here, we're clearing. Here, we're submitting, we're clicking. So we can actually take a look at exactly what's going on. And you can see here that everything thus far is passing. And this is what I absolutely love about Cypress, is this GUI. Now you can see here that there's a bunch of other tests. And all these tests are actually tests that are in separate files. So you can see here, you can actually go and click on this test. And now it's going to execute a separate lists of tests. And you can see here, these are some Cypress request tests. So this is absolutely terrific, and these are a bunch of example tests that Cypress gave us right off the bat. Now, where are they coming from? Well, when we did, and let me just quickly close this. It seems like it creates a new instance every time. So when we did npx Cypress open, what it did is create a bunch of files inside of this Cypress directory, and that's why I told you to watch this. So you can see here it created a Cypress directory, and this Cypress directory has 4 other directories. Fixtures, which we will talk about, don't worry, but for now we're not going to worry about. There's also plugins and support. We'll also talk about those, but for now I want you to focus on integration. And integration is basically where all of our tests are going to live. And you can see here inside of integrations, we have an examples directory. So if we open this, we can actually see all of the tests. So all of these tests are these tests over here. And these are just a bunch of examples that we can use. So we can actually go ahead and take a look at these tests if we're ever stuck, or if we want to look at them as reference. So you can see here we have a bunch of different tests. And basically these tests are performing those actions that we actually end up seeing on the screen. So you can see here that we're telling basically this test to visit this URL over here. So before each test, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, we're visiting this URL, and then what we're doing is we're doing a bunch of actions. We're getting a specific element, and then we're typing fake@email.com, and then we are doing some sort of assertion. We're saying that, hey, this should actually work. So once I type this, it should have value of fake@email.com. So this assertion works. And if this doesn't make any sense to you, don't worry, we're gonna cover all that in great detail. But again, if I click on this test again, You can see here fake@email.com. It was very, very quick, but you can see that that assertion actually ended up passing. All right, so that is terrific. That's pretty much what we want. But we obviously don't want to run all of these examples right over here. This is something that we probably want to ignore. This is just for us to use for reference. So we can either delete the examples or we can just ignore them. And that's what I actually suggest doing, is just ignore them so we can still have them for reference. Now, to basically configure everything that we really need, Cypress has this cypress.json file. And so in here, we can basically add a bunch of different configurations that we want. So one thing that I want is I want to ignore some test files. And I really want to ignore all of the test files that are inside of this examples directory. To do that, what we are going to do is just say ignore test files. And then we're going to say, hey, we want you to ignore all of the files that are inside of the examples directory. So anything inside of the examples directory, we want you to go ahead and ignore it. Now, another thing that I want to do is I want to specify a base URL. So over here, if you remember, we actually have to visit a specific URL to test it. Now, we can actually specify the URL every single time in here, or we can specify a base URL. Now, the URL that we are going to be using is simply localhost 3000. So let's actually go ahead and copy that. Let's get rid of this slash accomplishments. Let's just copy localhost 3000, and let's just specify here a base URL of localhost 3000. All right, so another thing that you can do is also manipulate the viewport width, and you can give this a specific number. Reason why this is failing is because it has to be a comma. So you can say that the viewport width, let's say we want it to be 1920, and the viewport height, we can say that, hey, we want this to be 1880. So now if we go ahead and save this, it should actually reflect inside of the GUI. Okay, so that is terrific, and that is really, really simple. This is what I mean about Cypress and how easy it is to actually set up a Cypress project. So that is pretty much it. And what you also can do is you can specify a different URL for different environments. So if you're in your local environment, you can specify this as your base URL. But if you are in staging or development or well, I guess you probably won't be testing in production, but if you're in staging or you're in development, then you can actually specify a different base URL. And I'll let you kind of explore how to do that, because it's kind of out of the scope of this crash course. All right, so we basically set up our Cypress testing framework inside of our application. In the next section, we're going to start learning about how we can actually get specific elements, because that's really what we need to do. In order to test our application, we first need to, well, get this element and then click on it, and then get this input element and then type in it, and then get this save button and then click on it. And then, you know, if we want to test something further, then we have to get this card, click on it, and then basically test things. So we have to consistently be able to get certain HTML elements, and that's going to be such a huge part of every testing framework that you use. So in the next section, we're going to learn about how to do that. Alright, in this section, we are going to learn about how we can locate or select for specific elements. Now, like I said, in order to perform any specific action and thus to test a certain flow, we need to perform some actions on specific elements. Again, for instance, we're gonna have to press the add button. Now, the only way that we're gonna do that is if we can somehow find this add button in the testing framework that we are using. And that is essentially what we are going to be learning how to do in this section. And this is a very, very important section. And this is why I have this elements section over here. And basically this is just a bunch of different buttons. But we are actually going to select for each button in a different way. And so we're gonna learn exactly how we can select for different elements in different ways so that we can have different variations if we need to. Now over here, we're using a bunch of buttons, but the rules that apply will actually apply for any sort of element that we want to select for or locate. Now, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using three very popular Cypress methods. So we're going to be using these methods to locate specific elements. And most notably, we're probably just going to be using these two, but I will also introduce this one. So as you can see here, and this is why we have this kind of division. We have get, and this is a separate Cypress method that we can use to locate elements. So we're going to be locating these elements with the get command. Over here we have contains, again, another separate method that we're going to be using to locate elements. And then we have the find command. Now, if you ever want to learn more about these elements, please feel free, go to the Cypress documentation, and you can see here all of the different commands that you can run. And there's no way I'm going to cover every single one. I'm going to try to cover the basis of Cypress, and then later on what you can do is you can start reading the documentation and fine-tuning your tests the way that you need to. So let's actually begin with get. And over here I'm basically at that get command. And what this is doing is basically getting one or more DOM elements by a selector. So what this is going to do is it's going to get one or more. So it's basically any sort of selector or any sort of criteria that a DOM element is met, it is going to get that for us. So let's actually go ahead and, well, let's actually try to recreate this. Now, if you go back here, you can see here that, hey, there's no Cypress files that are found. And that's because we decided to ignore all of the test files inside of the examples directory. And that's why we're getting this error. So what we're going to have to do is go to the integration, and we're going to have to add a new test file. Now, you can add this in a separate directory, so you can have a folder, but this has to, of course, be in the integration directory. So you can have another folder, such as we have over here with examples, or you can just put the test in the root integration directory. And that's what I'm going to do for now. But later on, for organization, you might want to have different directories, especially if you have a lot of tests. So let's actually create a test. So you can see here that the general format of the test is the name of the test .spec.js. And this is very, very important because Cypress is going to see the .spec.js and is going to interpret it as a Cypress test. So the naming is very, very important. And again, it has to be inside the integration directory. So let's create a test. And we're going to call this locators because we're, well, locating elements. So locators.spec.js. And as soon as I do this, if I go back over here, you can see that it is happy. If I click on it, however, well, there's really no tests that are running, and you get this kind of error saying, hey, well, there's no tests that were found, which is completely valid. All right, so let's actually go ahead and let's create our first test. Now, the first thing that I want to do is I want to tell VS Code that, hey, this is a Cypress file. And the best way to do that is to add this line at the very top. So // and then reference type Cypress. And this basically tells VS Code that, hey, this is a TypeScript or a Cypress file, and it basically helps us with kind of auto completion, which is pretty important. Alright, so now that we have created our test file, let's actually go ahead and write our first tests. Now, before we do that, we have to talk about how tests are typically organized. Tests are typically organized inside of a test file inside of blocks, and we can have multiple blocks inside of a test. But essentially, all tests inside of a block are related to one another in some way. Now, if you go back to this example, you can see that the block here is called context. So you can see here that the block is called context. And you can see here that it spans basically the whole test file. And typically we really just have one block, but we could have multiple. But you can also see here that inside of the block we have multiple tests. So over here we have it. This basically symbolizes a test. And this right here is the message of the test. And so this is a test that we have inside of this block. And over here we have another test. Over here we have another test, and so on and so on. So we need to have a block, and inside of that block we're going to have our tests. Now you can call this block context, but what I like to do, and this is really popular, I like to call this block describe. Now you can't call this block whatever it is that you want. This is really going to be dependent on the framework that you're using. It just so happens that in Cypress you can either call it context or describe. So this is going to take in two things. So you can see here it's going to take in a title that is a string, and then basically a function that is going to configure all of our tests. Now the title is going to basically contain a description of all the tests that are going to be inside of our block. Now I'm going to call this locators because this is just a bunch of tests that are going to locate specific elements. Now the second param is going to be an arrow function, or whatever function that you choose, and then inside of this arrow function we're going to have all of our tests. Alright, so that is terrific, so at least we learned that. Now the next thing that I want to basically teach you is that, hey, for each test we have to go to this page, localhost 3000/elements, and we have to do that for each test because we're testing all of the buttons inside of this page. Now to do that we can use a predefined hook called before each. So you can see here we have before all or before each. Before all runs once before all of the tests. Before each runs every single time before each test, and that's what we want. So we can say before each test, what we want you to do is we want you to visit localhost 3000/elements. Now how do we do that? Well, to do that we are going to use SY, which stands for Cypress, and Cypress is going to basically interpret this as, well, some sort of Cypress command. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do dot, and you can see here that we get a bunch of auto completion. And then we're going to say dot visit, and then we are going to visit, well, slash elements. So slash elements is what we called it. So slash elements. Now, how is it going to know, well, this is localhost 3000/elements? Well, the only way that this is going to know that is if you go to cypress.json. We've specified that the base URL is localhost 3000. And so what it's going to do is basically append localhost 3000/elements. All right, so before each test, we're going to run this. And then we're going to run our tests. Now, to run our tests, we're going to use the keyword it. And then similarly, we're going to have a string and then the configuration. So the string is going to define what the test is doing. So let's say locating elements with the get command. So with the get command, that's what we're going to be doing. And then over here, we're going to have the function. So we're going to have a function, and this is going to execute a specific test. So now if we actually save this and go back to our test runner and we click on locators.spec.js, it's going to spin up an instant, and you can see that it actually goes to this page. So it actually goes to this page. Now if we were to change this to like slash whatever, you can see that it goes to, well, slash whatever, which is just the home page in this case. But no, we want to go back to slash elements. All right, cool. So now let's actually go about and let's start getting our elements. And let's actually start very simply. We want to get all the buttons. So that is very, very simple. And this is a way of getting by tag name. So let me just quickly inspect this. What I'm going to do this a lot throughout the crash course. So I'm going to quickly zoom in. And you can see here that there's multiple different tag elements throughout our application. So you can see here we have a lot of divs. We also have some anchor tags. We also have, let's see here, we have some H2s. We have some whatever. So we have a bunch of different elements here. And let's say we want to get a specific element or all of the elements by a tag name. Well, let's say we want to get this button right over here. If we click on it, you can see, well, it has a tag name of button. So let's actually go ahead and let's get that specific button. All right, so to do that, what we are going to do is sy.get, because that's the command that we're using. And then in here, we're going to specify, well, the tag name. And you can see here that there's a bunch of different tags that we can basically use. But what we want to use is button. So if we save this and we go back to our running instance, you can see that everything has worked. This basically ran automatically once we saved our test and changed it. And now you can see here that it got all the buttons, and you can see here the number of buttons that it got, because the get gets all of the elements that match some sort of specification that we put over here. So basically in this page it saw 14 buttons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times 2, 14. And if you hover over it, you can see that it actually got them all. And you can see basically, this is what I love about Cypress. You can really visualize all of your tests. And you can see here that it got all of these buttons in this command. Okay, cool. So that is terrific. Now we can obviously do this with other HTML elements. For instance, we can do, hey, I want you to get all of the H3 tags. Similarly, you can see here that now it got all of the H3 tags. And we can also say, hey, we want to get all of the H2 tags. Now, you can see here that it got one H2 tag, which is really, really cool. Okay, so that is one way that we can actually get elements. Now, let's actually comment this. So we're getting all of the elements by tag name. So we're getting all of the elements by tag name. Now this is probably not the best way of getting elements, and you can probably see the reason why. Typically we don't want to get all of the elements. Typically we want to get one element, and getting it by a tag name typically results in more than one. And if it does still result in one, our application is consistently changing. So we may have just one button with that page at the moment, but then we might later on have more than one button. And you know what? That's not a great way to test our application. It's not a great way to actually select for elements. So what is another way? Well, we can actually maybe we can select for the class name. So you can see here, let's go to this button. This is just a regular button, and it has, well, elements button. But the button right next to it has another class of elements button. And then, let me open this up some more. But then it also has another class, button with class. So, well, this is a class, and we can actually query for this specific class. Now let's actually go about doing that. Now, how do we do that? Well, let's now get all elements by the class name. So we will do that with sy.get, and then instead of just flat out saying the class name, well, we were going to say the class name, but to specify that this is not a tag, what we're going to do is we're going to specify dot button with class. So now if we were to save this, you can see here that, cool. So now we have two elements. So we have basically these two elements specify this get command. And this makes sense. You can see here that, hey, this has a button with class, and similarly this one also has button with class, but no other one has that exact same class, btn with class. All right, cool. Now let's say what we want to do is we really don't want to get the element by just one class. We want to make sure that, hey, all of the elements match, or basically the button that we want basically matches the description that we specified here. So let's say we want to get this one over here, and we want to make sure that, hey, we want to get all the buttons that have a class of elements button, button with class, and then more button classes. So we want to get this button, and it has to match this exactly. So it can't have more, it can't have less. We want to match it exactly. Well, we can do that very, very easily with Cypress with attributes. So essentially here what we can do is, let's say, get all elements with specific class or specific classes. So here we can just do sci.get, and then inside of this string we can specify an attribute. So essentially what we're saying is, hey, we want to get an HTML tag with the following attribute. And how do we specify attributes? Well, we put them inside of these square brackets. And the attribute that we want is, well, class. And then in here, we're going to say that the class is equal to, well, elements btn with class, and then more btn classes. So more btn classes. So you can say here that, hey, we want to get the HTML element that has a class that is exactly equal to this. So now if we go back to our test runner, you can see that we get that one exact class, which is cool. Now we can do the exact same thing for this one over here. So let's say we want to get that other one. So let's actually go ahead and copy this. So we can say that, hey, we want to get the input element that has this exact same class. So if I save that, you can see that, hey, we get it. And that's because even though this contains the exact same stuff, it has elements button with class, it is not exactly that. And that's basically how we can really specify exactly what we want with attributes. Now, we can also get elements by ID. So let's actually go about doing that. And that's very easy. And we can actually do it through attributes. So we can do, let's see here, get all elements by ID. So we can do it with attributes. So we can say, hey, that this is going to have an ID that is equal to, let's actually go ahead and see what this ID is. So the ID is button with ID. So we can go ahead and save that. So we can definitely do it this way. This is completely valid, and you can see that this works. But we can also do it another way, kind of a similar way that we've done it over here. So we can basically say that, hey, we want an ID by specifying hashtag, which is, well, a symbol for ID, and then the ID itself. And again, you can see that it works perfectly fine. All right, cool. So now let's actually look at different attributes that we can select for. We can literally select for any attribute that we want. So for instance, even if the attribute is something like type submit, it's not a class or an ID, it's a type, or it could even be a placeholder, or it could be whatever it is that we want. We can select for it using this syntax over here. So let's go here and let's get all elements. And we're getting all elements because, again, the get method gets all the elements. So get all elements by tag name, or sorry, we're gonna get all the elements by a specific attribute, and this is the type attribute. So sy.get, and then over here we're gonna say that, hey, we want all the elements that are type equal to submit. So let's go ahead and let's save that, and very quickly, you can see here that we have 2. But ignoring this section over here, we can see that, hey, we get this one right over here, which is terrific. I hope this is large enough. Let's try to zoom in a little bit more. Or, I'm not sure if this is... Let's actually zoom out. Maybe if you can, maybe zooming out is actually makes it a little bit bigger. Okay, cool. All right, this is cool. Okay, so that makes sense. I hope it does. I hope it does make sense. Now, there's another few ways that we probably want to query our elements. Now, let's say we want to query our elements with a combination of different things. So not just with a specific attribute or a specific ID. Well, we can actually go ahead and do that. We can actually combine different attributes. So we can say that, hey, we want to get all the buttons with this ID and with this attribute. And we can actually very easily do that with Cypress. So let's actually go about doing that right now. So what we want to do is, let's say we want to get all of the buttons with a specific class. Okay, so we want to get all of the buttons with a specific class. And let's say this class is elements button, and this should literally give us all of the buttons because all of the buttons have elements button class as well as they're buttons. So how do we do this? Well, let's go ahead and let's do that. So let's say get all elements by tag name, because we were getting them by the button tag name, and class. So to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to do sy.get, and then we're going to specify the tag, and then we're also going to specify the class. Very easily, we can just do that with dot, and then we can just say elements btn. All right, cool. So very easily, you can see that we get everything. Again, because every single button has a tag name of button, of course, as well as that class, because that's what's giving it these styles. All right, cool. Now we can do this with multiple other things. For instance, we can also get let's see here, get all elements by tag name and class and ID. So we can do sy.get. So we can say button dot, and then this is the class itself. So elements btn, and then let's say the ID. So over here we can just append a hashtag, and then we can say btn with ID. So that was one of the IDs for one of the buttons. So again, you can see here that now we are only selecting this specific button. All right, cool, and very cool. All right, and then let's actually do one that's a little more complicated that kind of involves these attributes. So you can see here now, let's say get all elements by tag name and class and some sort of type attribute. And yeah, so we're gonna say we want to basically get the tag name, the class, and we want to make sure that the type is equal to submit. So similar to this one over here. And let's change that to get. All right, so very easily, sy.get, and now we can say that, hey, the tag name is a button. The class is gonna be elements btn, and then the type is going to be type of submit. If we go ahead and save this, you can see here that we have two that actually follow this, which is, well, that's pretty interesting. But see, if we actually went ahead and which one follows this actually? So this is the third one. The third one in the contains. If we actually click on this, you can see that type is submit. So it's working as we intended. Now, let's actually talk about the absolute best way and the best practice of selecting elements. The reason why this way is not that great is because these class names can change. For instance, we can change this class name. We can change the ID. We can change the type. It could potentially change. It might not be likely, but it's very possible that this ends up changing. And like one great example is that if we're selecting by button, we could add another button. We could remove a button. We could change it to an anchor tag. And so these tests are not really resilient. And the best way to actually make them resilient is by giving them some sort of unique identifier that is specific for the tests only. So they're really not going to change throughout our application because these unique identifiers are specific to the test only. And that can be done by basically appending data. So you can basically append any sort of attribute that you want into whatever element. So you can see here a button with test ID. If we go here, you can see here that we have a button that has a class, but it also has this other attribute, data/sci, standing for Cypress. And this can be, well, your unique identifier. And you can, again, append this to whatever element that you want. And typically, if you want to append any sort of kind of unique attribute, it would have this format, data/ and then whatever it is that you want to call it. For instance, in React testing library, it's called data/test ID. And the React testing library actually specifically queries for an attribute that looks like this. Now, what's great about Cypress is you can call this whatever it is that you want. And then you can basically query for it in this way. So you can do get all elements by tag, or actually no, not by tag name. Get all elements with specific data test ID. And so now what we can do is we can do just sci.get, and we can say that, hey, we want to get all the elements that have this specific attribute. Sy data is equal to, what do we call it here? We called it btn id1. So now if we save this, this fails for some reason, and that's because, well, I have to fix the quotes, of course. So now if I save this, you can see that it passes. Nope, still fails, which is strange. Okay, what am I doing here? No, sorry, the attribute is data/sci, not sci/data. So data/sci. If I save this, now it works perfectly fine. But this is actually kind of good because you can see what happens is if it can't find the selector, what it does is it retries it and then it ends up actually failing. Because everything here is actually an assertion. Even getting elements is an assertion. And if you end up failing anything, it actually ends up failing that specific assertion and thus ends up failing that test, which is really cool. And that's ultimately kind of what we want. So now we can go ahead and we can fix this. And you can see here, perfect. So this is terrific. Now, one thing that I want to note is that this can kind of get a little bit ugly. For instance, here, this can kind of get a little bit ugly, this kind of syntax. Don't you probably wish there was some sort of like sci.get by test ID or sci.get by class or sci.get by type? This can get pretty unattractive. And the way that we can actually create and inject commands inside of Cypress, commands that we typically use throughout our application, is inside of this supports over here. And inside of the commands.js, you can basically have a bunch of different commands that we are going to use throughout our application. And you can see here that this is how the common structure is. So we have cypress.command and then .add and then the name of the command, and then basically essentially what we are going to be doing inside of that command. So let's actually go about creating some methods that are going to make our application just a lot prettier. Okay, cool. So let's do that right now. So let's say we're gonna do it for this one right over here. So we're gonna do it for this one. So we're going to go and we're going to create a new command. So we're gonna do Cypress, and then we're going to do commands, and we're going to add a command. And then over here, we're going to specify the name of the command. So we're going to say get by test ID. And then we're going to have an arrow function. And in here, is basically whatever that we pass in. So inside of this parameter is whatever we pass into that command. So whatever we want to pass into it. So over here we can just say test ID. And so now what we can basically do is we can do sci.get, and then in here, so this is how it would typically look like. So remember, it's going to be the data slash sci is equal to whatever ID that we specified in here. So what we want to do is we want to basically inject this test ID into here. So to do that, we can use template literals. So let's use template literals. And then we can just say test ID. So now we can go ahead and save this. Now in here, what we can do, is instead of doing this long kind of ugly command, now we can do is sci get by test ID, and then we can just pass in the test ID. So let's go ahead and save this, and it works. It works completely fine. At the end of the day, it basically executes the same thing. And now we can have basically nicer syntax. This is just something that I wanted to introduce to you. I'm not going to be doing this because I want you to kind of get used to the real way of querying elements. But this is something that you might want to do later on, is mess around with these commands. Plus, it doesn't have to be just one command. We can have multiple commands. If you're executing something regularly, like let's say you need to log into your application to actually run some of your tests, you can actually just put it in here. So you can do something like, /login. So /login, and then in here you can have all of the different tests. So let's say you have, multiple different tests that or multiple different things that you need to do to log in. And then what you would do over here is, or inside of your test, you would just simply do sci.login, and then bam, you're logged in. So it doesn't have to be just one little thing. You can actually have multiple different things in there. All right, cool. So that is pretty much it. And this video is kind of getting long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video. And then in the next section, we're going to cover how we can query with, contains. So far, we have been able to locate elements using the get command. But there's many commands in the Cypress world that allows us to locate elements. One such command is the contains command. Now, if we go to the docs right over here, the Cypress documentation, it says that contains allows us to get the DOM element that contains a specific text. So what it does is it gets only one element that contains a specific text that we have specified, and we can basically use it as such. We can have .contains and then some sort of text. Now, what do I mean by text? Well, when we go here, you can see here that we have elements, we have get, we have this button, we have button with many class names, and this is the text that we have talked about. So let's say we want to get, this one right over here. We want to get this element, then we would do a cy.contains and then elements, the string elements. And what it's going to do is it's going to get this particular h2 tag. Now this is really cool because it really simulates what the user is ultimately going to do. Because the user ultimately is not really going to care about, hey, I want to click this button with this type submit. I want to click this button with data test ID. Ultimately, they're just going to look at the page. You're going to be like, okay, I want to click on accomplishments. I want to click on habit. And so this really simulates ultimately what the user is going to be doing. So this is what it is ultimately doing. It's getting one element. So get gets all the elements. This only gets one element that specifies the text that we put inside of the parameter. Now we can do this in multiple ways. This is the most typical, but we can also do it like this, where we specify a selector, which is some sort of input or class or ID, and then we can specify the content itself. So this actually is kind of a more specific way of doing it, and we're going to look at the multiple different ways. We're not going to cover all of them, but if you want, you can read through the documentation. It's very thorough and allows us to really understand exactly how we can use the contains command. All right, cool. So let's go about doing that right now. So let's actually go ahead and let's start querying for some of these buttons. And now what we want to do is we want to query by their specific text. So let's query this button first. It says here unique text. You can see here that there's no other button with unique text as well. It's unique text. So let's go ahead and let's query for that. So let's do this actually inside of another test. So it's going to still be in the describe block, but it's going to be a different test because now we're not locating elements with get, we're locating elements with contains. All right, so we're going to do it. We're going to say locating elements with contains. Okay, and now what we're going to do is we're going to get a specific element by text, and specifically we're going to get by the text of unique text. So what this is going to do is going to return this button right over here. So to do that, let's just put a comment. So get element by text, and now we're going to do cy, or sci for Cypress, dot contains, and then we're going to say unique button, I believe, or unique text is what we called it. So if I save this and if I go back over here, you can see that now we have two tests running. So you can see all the tests ran here, and what's cool is you can see that, hey, this before each ran, and then this body ran over here. And also we have locating elements with contains. We have a before each, and you can see here that if I hover over this, this has successfully found the correct button. So I actually found it with the correct text. So now let's actually start using the contains, but let's use it when the button or the text is not unique. So over here we have not unique text, and you can see that it's clearly not unique because we have this button with this text, and this button with the same text, and this button with the same text, and then this button with the same text. So it's clearly not unique. Now what happens when that occurs? So let's just give that a go. So we're going to say get element, and this is still get element by text, but the text is not unique. So let's do Cypress or sci dot contains, and then we're going to say not unique text. If I go ahead and save this, and now you can see if I hover over it, it just still gets one. It doesn't get this, it doesn't get this, it doesn't get this. It only gets this rightmost one right over here, the right top one. And that's because the contains only gets one element. So the first element that it matches, it's going to get that one element. So it's really good in that, hey, it gets one element, so we can actually start performing actions on that element. But we have to really be careful because, hey, if we have multiple elements that contain the same text, we might be intending to get this button, but ultimately we end up getting this button. So we do have to be careful. And so that way we actually have to start specifying, well, selectors if we really want to pick whatever it is that we want. So we can have any type of selectors. And remember, selector could be a name, it could be a class, it could be a combination of things. For instance, we can have a selector where we select for type submit, and then we can also have a dot contains that contains a specific text. For instance, we can have, let's say here, we are basically combining, we can have cy, so this is with selector, so with selector, and we can do dot contains, and then over here we can say, hey, we want this to be equal type submit, and then we can say as the second string the actual text, the actual content. So over here we can say not unique text. So if you save this, you can see completely passes, and you can see that it actually picks the correct one. So again, we can combine selectors with contains, and contains, what it does is it kind of ensures that, hey, we only get one, which is actually needed if we want to perform some action. Now we can combine the contain with the get. for instance, we can get a specific element, and then we can basically say, from all those elements, I want the one element that contains this text. So let's actually try that. So now what we can do is we can do something like, you know, sci.get, and then we can get, let's do the exact same thing. So let's just paste that in there. And then we can do dot contains, and this is ultimately going to result in the exact same thing. So not unique text, save it. And you can see here it results in the exact same thing. It was just a little bit different. You can see here that it got this, and you can see that it got actually both. Remember, get gets both. And then we're gonna say dot contains this. So it's just an extra way of kind of ensuring that, hey, this is the selector, or this is the element that we ultimately want. All right, so let's see my notes here. What other ones do I have? You know, other things, of course, that we can do. This doesn't always have to be an attribute selector. It could also be an input. So we can say here that, hey, we want to get the selector is going to be a form. So the selector is going to be a form, and then we want to get the button, or basically the element that has this specific text over here. So let me kind of illustrate what this is doing. So let me quickly save this. And you can see here that this, okay, so this passes. Now, what is it doing exactly? Well, there is no form element that contains the text not unique text. But what's happening is if let's go hover right over here, you can see that there is a form element, and inside of that form element, we have a button that contains not unique text. So what's happening here is we're saying, okay, get the form element, and then find the input element that contains not unique text that is inside of that form element. And that's essentially what's happening. And that's why we're able to get this specific element. All right, cool. So that's pretty much it. The last thing that I'm going to cover is find. So if we go back to the documentation, let's go over here to find. Find is very, very similar. What it does is it basically finds descendants DOM elements of a specific selector. So essentially we get a selector with the get article, and then we basically find a specific element which is going to be a descendant of it. So basically this footer tag is going to be inside of the element with this particular class. Now we can never just do sci.find because we need to chain this. We need to have some sort of parent because it's going to find a child node element. So let's just quickly go over this. I'm not going to go over it too much because we're not going to use it all that much, but it's something that we could do. So let's say locating elements with find. So we're going to say with find. So here what we're going to do is we're going to do sci.get, and we're going to basically get a parent. So we're going to get a parent, and let's say the parent is the form. So let's actually go over here and let's go back to our, so over here we have let's actually inspect this and let's look into this over here. So we can see here that we have a form, and this form houses two buttons, and this form has an ID of form1, and again it houses two different buttons. So now what we can do is we can basically say, okay, well, get the form that is that contains the or get the element that has the ID of form1, and what I want you to do is find any child inside of this element that has the class of btn1. So that is going to get this one over here because this is btn1, this one's btn2. Again, works completely fine. You can see here that it gets all of it and then it finds this one. Cool. All right, so let's actually do that again, but for btn2. All right, cool. And if we go back to our test, again, you can see that it gets it, finds that one. And it doesn't have to be just get, it could also be contains, as long as there is some sort of child element inside of that element that was received from the contains that we want to query for. So that pretty much sums it up. Those are the main ways that we can actually start selecting our elements. Now that we learned that, let's actually start selecting our elements and performing actions. And the best way to do this is to actually practice it with real life examples. So what we're going to do is we're going to test habits. So we're going to have multiple tests for habits, and we're going to have multiple tests for accomplishments as well. And we're going to cover exactly what the tests are, and hopefully as we continuously go through them, they're going to start making more and more sense, and you're going to be more confident with writing your own tests. Now that we have covered the basic concepts of Cypress, let's go ahead and actually write our first tests. And specifically, we're going to write tests for the habits page, and we're going to be writing 3 different tests. So for the first test we're going to write is, once we click the add button, we should expect this modal to pop up. So that's the first test that we're going to write. The second test is, once we click the add button and then input some sort of habit like drink a cup of water, and then save this habit, we see this card display. And then the last test that we can write is, hey, once we add a card, we can click on it to toggle the image from checked to X. Now there's other things that we can also test, but we're not going to. For instance, you can also test that we're able to actually type into this input. We can also test that, hey, if we don't type anything and we try to save the changes, nothing happens. And then we can also test that, hey, we can also close the modal. So those are 3 additional tests that you can write. But I think the first 3 that I'm going to cover is kind of a good enough foundation that will allow you to eventually start writing your own tests. So let us begin with that right now. So as you know, if we want to write a test, we're going to have to put it in a test file. Now this test file is specifically just for locators. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another test file, and we're going to call this test file habit.spec.js. And this is where all of our dashboard habits tests are going to be located. So as usual, we're going to put in the reference. So let's put in there, and then we're going to need a describe block. So let's say describe. We're going to say habit dashboard, because these are all the tests that are related to the habit dashboard. And then in here, let's start off with the very first test. When I click on this modal should appear. Okay, cool. So the first thing that we need to do is add a before each hook to go to /habits. So let's actually go ahead and do that. Let's do before each, and then let's say sci.visit, and we're gonna visit habits. So before each, we're gonna visit habits. Now, one thing about these hooks, we can actually, there's multiple different hooks that we can use. For instance, there is the before all hook. This is a hook that runs one time before all the hooks. And then there's also after each and after all. So, you know, if you ever need to perform actions after each test is ran or after all tests have been written, something like you know, clearing the data or going back to some sort of initial response, you would do it with these hooks. But we're going to only use the before each hook in this crash course. Okay, so the first test is, hey, again, a modal should appear when I click the add button. So I'm going to say should display modal when add button is clicked. That's the description of the test. And then now we're going to have to, well, perform certain actions. So we're going to have to somehow click on this button. Now when we click on this button, essentially what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to find this button in Cypress. So let's actually go ahead and let's inspect this button. And let's go ahead and let's go over here, and you can see that, okay, this is a button. It has a class of habit add button. It also has an ID, and it also, you can look at the text itself. In this page, there's only the add text, so we could potentially just go ahead and use contains. So there's definitely many different ways that we can go. I'm going to use the contains because there's only this one add text in here. Now it's actually good to combine contains with another selector just in case add appears more than once eventually in the future. So let's go ahead and let's say that, let's do sci.contains, and we're going to say that the selector is a button and the text is add. And then what we're going to do is we want to perform some sort of action. So what this is going to do, and let's quickly save this. Okay, let's save. It seems like it's not refreshing. Let's go back, actually. You can see here that there's another integrated test. So we can click on this. And you can see that, okay, cool. So it got that button. But now we want to perform an action on that button. Well, to do that, all we have to do is just append another command. And the other command that we're going to append, and you can just, when you do dot, you can basically hover over the other commands that we can use. But the other command that we're going to use is dot click, because, well, we want to click on this button. So now we can go ahead and save that. And you can see that, okay, basically it got that button and then it clicked on that button, and eventually, let's just quickly refresh it. You can see that the modal actually pops up. So now we have to basically assert that this modal exists. And how do we do that? Well, we do that with assertions. Assertions are basically little tests that we take, that we do to ensure that our quality of code is the way that we intend it to be. So we basically are going to assert that, hey, this modal has appeared. So let's go do that right now. So let's first do that by doing sci, and we want to get this modal. So we want to eventually get this modal. Now, to get this modal, again, we need to find some sort of selector. So let's go ahead and let's get this modal. And let's actually get this modal by this text over here. Add a new habit, because if this text appears somewhere in the document, then we know this modal also has appeared because this text is attached to the modal. So we can do dot contains this. So we can say sci.contains this, and we can go ahead and save it, and you can see that everything has been running successfully. Now, what I like to do, instead of just do sci.contains to do our assertion, I like to add the should keyword, and this is what is eventually going to assert it. And we're going to say that, hey, this should, and then in here we have a string of a bunch of different things that we can add, and you can take a look at them. But you can see here be null, be okay, be one, but we're gonna say be visible. This should be visible. So this should be visible. So you can go ahead and save that, and you can see this assertion has been successful. All right, cool. All right, so now let's move on to the next test. So the next test is when you click the add button and then you add some sort of habit, then we should see this card on the page. Okay, so let's do that. So we're gonna do should display habit card when new habit is added. All right. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to have to get this button over here and click on it. So let's actually do it a little bit differently this time. Let's do it with the get, just to spice things up. So you can see here that this habit, this card has an ID. So let's just do sci.get. We're going to do hashtag this ID. And then what we're going to do is we are going to click on this button. And then let's actually go ahead and save this. So let's just double check that it works. Okay, it does work. Terrific. We get our modal. And then what we want to do is we want to, once we click on this, we want to type some sort of habit inside of this input. So how do we get this input? Well, very easily. We can get it with, let's actually inspect it. We can get it by saying, hey, we want the input, or we can even get it by an attribute. So we can say, hey, go to the input that has a placeholder of habit, or go to the tag that has a placeholder of habit. To spice things up, let's actually do that. Let's say that, hey, we want an input that has a placeholder of habit. So let's do sci.get, and we're gonna say input, and then we're gonna say that it has a placeholder of habit. And then we're gonna perform some action on that input. So we can append here another action, and this is going to be the type action. Now, you can basically read about all of the different things that Cypress can do by literally just going to their docs. So you can see that there's a bunch of different things, and we're not going to cover all of them. But for instance, there's multiple different actions that we can perform, like focus or hover, or literally anything that you can probably imagine. Scroll to, anything that the user can possibly do. Cypress has something similar to that. So there's multiple different actions, but most of the time you're going to probably be using click or type. But if you ever need to test some other action, please go over the Cypress documentation. All right, so what we're going to type is, let's say, drink a cup of water. So that's what we are going to type. So let's go ahead here and let's just see that in action. So you can see here, okay, cool. Now what we want to do is we want to click on this Save Changes button. So again, let's go ahead and inspect this button. This is a button with Save Changes. This actually use just contains for that. So let's do sci.contains and then save changes dot click. All right. And then what we should do is, once we type in something, what we should be able to do is basically see that thing as a card inside of our dashboard. So what we could potentially do is just say that, hey, sci.contains, and then we're going to say whatever that we've typed in here. We're going to say that, hey, this should, and we're going to say this should be visible. So this should be visible. And let's actually do this just to make it a little bit nicer. So this should be visible. And one thing that's great about Cypress is we can have multiple assertions. For instance, we could also say that, hey, this should be visible, and we can have another .should. So we can also say that, hey, this should also have, let me get rid of this. This also should also have class, so have class of, let's quickly inspect this. I forget what the class should be. But this also should have class of, so I believe this is the text. So it should also have this particular class over here. So it should have habit card __ habit container. So we can have multiple assertions in here. So we can go ahead and save it, and you can see that it has successfully been done. Now, one thing for syntax, if we have one should, instead of having another should, we can also just say and instead, and it's going to do the same thing. So we're going to say it should be visible and have this and that and that, and ultimately it results in the exact same thing. Now, how do you know what types of assertions we can have? Well, again, what you can do is you can just put the quotes, and you can basically just read through the assertions that you want to use. For instance, like, I mean, these are very, very easy to understand. So you can basically see, okay, oh, to be called once. So maybe here we're asserting a function. Over here we're saying, hey, we expect this to be disabled, or we expect it to be hidden. We expect it to be null. So you can just read through all of these different assertions that we have. And then you can basically use whatever assertion accordingly. And you can always, of course, go to the docs and try to understand exactly what assertion works best for you. All right, cool. So that's that. So now let's go through the last one where we click on it, we add a habit, and then we basically click on this, and this icon should particularly change. So let's add another test. So we're gonna say should toggle icon when habit card is clicked. So the first thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna get that button. So let's actually just copy and paste this. So let's actually copy and paste what we've done thus far. So let's go ahead and let's copy these two, or these three. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna get the button and click on it. Then we're gonna add this placeholder, we're gonna type this into the input, and then we're gonna click on the Save Changes button. And then what we're going to do now is we're actually going to click on the card that was created. So what we're eventually gonna get is a card that contains this text. So what we can do is we can do sci.contains, and then we can just do e.click. Okay, cool. So now what we can basically do is once we click on this, let's just quickly see this right now. So the first thing that we do is we get this X right here. And let me just see. You can see that this has an image tag and the source is this over here. So what we can basically say is initially we can say that sci.get, and then we can say that, hey, the source should be equal to this. And then we can insert that this should be visible. So this should be visible. So when I save this, you can see that this has failed. Okay, let's see why that has failed. Did I do things incorrectly here? Okay. I wonder why that actually failed. Let's see. Drink a cup of water. Oh, it seems like because we clicked on it. So actually we don't want to click on it. So initially we're not going to click on it. And we should see the X. And that succeeded, which is cool. But then when we do click on it, so let's actually go ahead and click on it now. Now this should not be visible. It actually should be the check. So this test should fail, and it will fail. But essentially you can see here that when I click on it, you can see that it changes, and it changes to checked. So let's actually just copy that, and then let's say checked. And now you can see that all of our tests pass. Alright, so I think that does it, and I think that kind of clears everything up. Again, there's more things that we can potentially test. For instance, we could also test that, hey, if you don't put anything, nothing changes. Or if you close this, the modal disappears. So that's something that you can probably test on your own for practice, but these are the 3 tests that we are going to write for this page. Now we're going to move on to the next page, which is the accomplishments page. Let us practice Cypress by just writing a few more tests. And these tests are going to be tests that are related to the accomplishments dashboard. So let's quickly go over the tests that we are going to write. The first test is if you don't put any valid input, for instance, if you have a missing title or a missing accomplishment, or we didn't go ahead and check this box, we get this error over here saying that, hey, please complete the items above to continue. So we're going to test for that. The next thing that we are going to test is Okay, on a success, so let's say we do input everything, well, we eventually get this loading state, and then we get this kind of success page, and then we're gonna basically test out, hey, we get the success page. What's interesting about this is that we don't get this text right away. We have to wait a few seconds, and I kind of did this on purpose to kind of simulate asynchronous requests, and I'm gonna show you how Cypress deals with asynchronicity, and it deals with it very, very easily. Now the last test we're going to do is once we go ahead and go to the success page, we're just going to test that, hey, once we go back to this dashboard and all of the input is empty. Because remember, it wasn't empty before. Then you click on it. Then you go back and you can see that it is empty now. All right, so those are the tests that we're going to write. And let's quickly begin with the test that basically tests for this error message. So to do this, let's go to our Cypress directory. In here, let's create another test file, and then this test file is going to be, let's call it accomplishments.spec.js, and then let's copy the reference. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have a describe block. So a describe block, and then in here, remember, we're going to have a description of this. I'm just going to call this accomplishment dashboard. And then we're going to have a fat arrow function. And then we're going to have our before each hook. And this is just going to visit the page that we want it to visit. So we're going to do sci.visit. And then we're going to say slash accomplishments. So sci.visit slash accomplishments. All right, cool. Now let's go ahead and write our first test. And this test we're gonna say should showcase error if information is missing. So showcase the error if this information is missing. So we can go ahead, and the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to basically press this submit accomplished button, but we're gonna be missing some fields. For instance, we can say we're missing the let's say we input this, but we don't check the box. So now we can basically we still get this error. Now one thing that we could do is we can basically test it for each case. So let's say we do check the box, but we don't put in a title. We can also test that out. But for now, let's just say that, hey, we put in everything, but we don't check the box. And we should get this error over here. Okay, cool. So now let's just do sci.get. And now let's get by placeholder. So we're going to say that, hey, we want to get, let's actually, I believe for this, what I did was I gave this a data test ID, or I guess, yeah, right here, I gave it a data test ID. So let's actually get by this attribute. So let's get by this attribute, because it's very, very likely that in the future, I believe I just deleted the whole thing, in the future that this placeholder is going to change. Maybe we don't want it to be called title anymore. Maybe we want it to call my accomplishment title or whatever. You know, it could potentially change. So let's actually get it by data test ID. So let's go over here, and we're going to say that the data test ID is equal to this, and then we're going to type something. So let's say type, and I'm going to say my basketball accomplishment. So my basketball accomplishment. And then let's go ahead and let's get the other one, and let's see what I called this over here. So let's go here, and then this is called accomplishment input. So that's what the data test ID is. So we can do data sci, or you can say accomplishment input. And we can also type something in here as well. Let's type in I made 10 threes in a row. And then we're not going to check this box over here. We're just going to go ahead and click the submit button. Let's get this by the text with contains. So let's do let's do sci.contains, and then we're gonna say submit accomplishments, or submit accomplishment, and then we're gonna go ahead and click this button. So let's go ahead and just quickly test that thus far everything works out fine. So let's go back to our test, because now we have a new test file. Okay, so you can see here that everything seems fine. However, it doesn't seem like it's not typing in the title. And this is good. This is what I love about the GUI, because it makes it easy for me to catch exactly what is going wrong, because that's not something that I particularly expected. So it seems like, okay, so it seems like I got both the selectors. So essentially the selector here is actually accomplishment title input. So let's actually fix that. So now if I save this, you can see that everything is fine, and we do get this error, but we want to assert that we get this error. So let's do sci.contains this, and then we're going to say should, and then we're going to say should be visible. So let's go ahead and save that, and then we can see here that we have successfully asserted this test. Alright, so now let's actually wait for the positive case, where we actually type something, we check the button, and then eventually let's assert that we get this landing page. And to assert that we get this landing page, let's say that we get this success over here. Now again, one thing that's interesting about this is we don't get it right away. So you might think for other testing frameworks, you know, we were gonna have to do something like wait for, because most testing frameworks run synchronously. However, Cypress runs asynchronously, and if it can't find an element, what it's going to do is it's going to rerun it until it eventually times out. And that's really, really, really cool. So let's actually go ahead and let's actually write our test. And that way we don't have to really worry about asynchronicities, which is really amazing when it comes to this test. So let's say should display. So this should display validation. We're going to say the validation component if all information is input. Say that this is an arrow function. And then we're going to do sci. And let's just basically do what we've done here thus far. So we basically we're getting the element and then we're typing it. But now what we want to do is we also want to click on the checkbox. So we can do sci.get, and this is actually an input element with if you go back, this is actually an input element but with type of checkbox. We could use the let's actually use this. You know what, let's use, just to spice it up, let's use type checkbox. Now later on, if we have multiple checkboxes, we're probably not going to want to locate elements in this way, but just to learn, we can do it this way. So we can say type checkbox, and then we can say, hey, we want to click on this, and then all we have to do at this point is do sci.contains. So remember, once we have successfully done everything, we get this text over here. So we can basically say that sci.contains this text, and then this should be visible. Alright, so again, one thing that's really interesting about this is this text is not visible right away because we get that loading state for some period of time. However, at the end of the day, what it's going to do is it's going to rerun the test until that thing is successful. So let's actually go ahead and let's refresh this. And you can see here that, I actually forgot to click on the button, so that's why that failed. So let's go ahead and let's just click on the button. So let's do this again. So click on the button. You can see that it's basically waiting, and then it went ahead and was successful. And that's terrific. Then that's really, really good. And it's basically just going to wait some sort of a specified amount of time until it's like, okay, well, until basically it basically times out. All right, cool. Okay, so that is that. And then the last thing we're gonna test is basically once we go back, then what we want to do is we want to go back to this page over here, and we want the input elements to be empty. So let's just copy this test over here. And then we're gonna change this to should return back to accomplishment dashboard with empty input when go back button is clicked. So when we press the go back button, we should go back to the accomplishment dashboard, and the inputs should be empty. So let's just get rid of this assertion right over here, and let's just do contains, and then here we're gonna say go back, and we're just going to go ahead and click on this. So we're gonna click on it, and then what we're gonna do is we want to say that, hey, we go back to this page. So let's say that, hey, this piece of text is available, so we can do something like contains, and we can say h2, and then we can say the actual content, and then we can insert that this should be visible, and then we want to insert that the values of these things are empty. So let's actually go ahead and get these. So let's go over here. We got them with this right here, but this time we're going to say that instead of typing into them, we're going to do an assertion on them. So we're going to say that, hey, these guys should have value of empty. So they should have value of empty. Similarly over here, this should have value of empty. Now the last thing is we're going to make sure that this is not checked. So let's get this element over here. And then we're going to say .should, and then we can see here that we have b.checked. So b.checked. So this is basically asserting that this should be checked. Now with every single assertion, we can add not in the beginning to basically have the opposite case. So not be checked. So we can go here, save it. Let's just wait a little bit, and there we go. The last one. And there we go. Everything has been successful. So cool. So that is another set of tests, and that's pretty much it for project 1. Now we're going to move on to project 2, where we're going to actually be dealing with a client that actually is communicating with a real server. And we're going to figure out how we can test things with that. So far, we have been dealing with testing applications that are not making HTTP requests to a backend service. Now, in this section, we're going to change that. We're actually going to work with our same client, our dashboard application, but this time it is going to be interacting with a server that I also created, and it's going to basically mock an application that actually interacts with the server. Now, one thing that's great about this is because Cypress is inherently asynchronous, it's really not ultimately going to change how we test our application. So regardless if it's going to make HTTP requests or not, the tests are ultimately going to stay relatively the same. So let me just kind of explain 2 different approaches that we can take when testing our application. Now, before I do this, go ahead and go to project 2, and in project 2 you can see here that we have a client and a server. So in order to open up the client, just cd into the client and then do an npm install to install all of the dependencies, and then do an npm start to start that application, and you should get a terminal window that looks a little something like this. Now then cd out of it and then go to the server. So go to the server. So then you would just, in another terminal window, you would cd into the server directory, install all of the dependencies, and then do node index.js to start the running server. You should see a terminal that looks a little something like this. Don't mind these errors. You should see something like, now listening on port 3000. And the last thing that we need to do is, once everything is up and installed, just go to the client, so cd into the client, and then just do an npx Cypress open in order to, well, initialize a Cypress application and open it up inside of your terminal window. And this is very familiar. We've seen this before. And let's actually just quickly get rid of this. So over here, we're just going to say that we want to ignore some files. So let's go ahead and let's do that right now. Let's go and ignore some of these files, and let's specify a base URL. So we're going to say the base URL is http://localhost 3000. Then we're going to say that, hey, we want to ignore some test files, and these test files exist right in the examples directory. And that's pretty much it. So if we save this and we eventually go back, we should see some errors, and that error basically should, well, let's actually just say that I got this. We should see basically an error saying that, hey, there's no test files here. So it seems like it has just pretty much failed, which is essentially what we want ultimately. All right, cool. So now the absolute last step, and it seems like, let's actually go ahead and let's just do npx Cypress open. So now what we want to do is we actually want to test out our application. Now our application is a little bit different. So our application, if we go to localhost 3000 and I refresh the page, you can see here that the application is a little bit different. So over here, instead of elements, we have rewards, and we're going to test this out first. So essentially what this is a bunch of rewards that basically we got for accomplishing our habits. But this isn't something that we went ahead and input right away from the client. This is actually a request that we made to our server, and our server got us back this data. And we can actually see this by looking at the network tab. So if I were to refresh this, you can see that, hey, we made a request to localhost 4000 right over here. So localhost 4000/rewards, and we got back this data. And over here, you can see that we got this data. So what we can do is we can basically test that we got this data. And essentially, there's two ways that we can basically test something that's interacting with a server. So the first thing is we can basically test the client and the server. So we can basically say, hey, I expect that, hey, we get this list. So we get this list. And essentially what this is doing is it's testing that, hey, the client is rendering it appropriately, as well as the server is sending that data. So we can basically test these things simultaneously. Or what we can do is mock the HTTP request. And that way, essentially what's going to happen is we're going to send back some dummy data that's not coming from our actual server, but it's mocking what actually our server is sending. And that way we can really just focus on testing the client side over the server side. And there's very, very good reasons why we want to do this, and I'll get to it in a little bit. But first, let's just do this one over here, and let's just test that, hey, we get these basically this list right over here. Okay, so let's just make sure that everything is running appropriately. So it seems as though everything is running. We have our tests. Okay, got it. Seems like in the Cypress.json, I did put the You know what? Let's just get rid of the examples. Let's just get rid of it. I'm not sure why that's not working appropriately. So let's just do that. And now if I were to refresh, I guess this is still not working. Okay, cool. So now in here, what we're gonna do is we're going to add another test file. This is gonna be called rewards.spec.test. So rewards.spec.test, and this is JS, not TypeScript. And then in here, we're going to, let's just double check that this works. Cool, it does. In here, we're just gonna have our reference. So remember, we're gonna have that reference type. And that reference type is gonna be of type Cypress. And then we're gonna have our describe block. So the describe block, and this describe block is going to be called accomplishment dashboard. Or actually, wait, this is not the accomplishments. We're going to call this the rewards dashboard. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to test that, hey, these rewards are basically placed here. We can actually see this rewards, and what that does is it basically tests the client that it's rendering these rewards appropriately, and also testing the server, which is sending off these rewards. And if you want to see the server, very simple application. You can see here that we have a get route that basically sends back these rewards. Very easy. It's not interacting with the database or anything. And then we also have a post route that we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, cool. So the first thing that we're going to do is inside of this describe block is, as always, we need a before each hook. That's going to do sci.visit. And then we're going to go to /rewards. And then let's have our first test. So we're going to say should display a list of rewards. So should display a list of rewards. And then in here, what we can do is we can just say sci.get, and what we can do is we can basically get, let's actually inspect this. If we inspect this, you can see here that we have a UL tag. So let's actually get this UL tag. So sci.get this UL tag, and then we can say that inside of this UL tag, we should have some text that contains this right over here. So we have this text and we have this text. So let's just say dot should, and we should say that it should contain, and then we're going to say it should contain 500 points. 500 points for drinking 8 cups of water for 7 days straight. We can also append an and in there. And then we can say 850 points for fasting for 5 straight days. So if I were to save this and go back here and run this test, you can see everything is fine and dandy. It actually works. And again, what this is doing is it's testing both the client and the server. And what's great about Cypress is you can see the HTTP request that was made. So it made this, and then it went ahead and asserted that, hey, the client and the server are working correctly, which is cool. But there's some cases where we actually don't want to get the data from the server itself. And the reason for this is, let's say we are asserting the content, but what if the server is dynamic and it always is going to render different content? What if, for instance, it's not going to render this and it's not going to render that? Maybe it changes over time. That could cause some failures. Also, what if the server renders this content relatively slow and we want our test to run a lot faster? So that is a problem. And another problem is we could basically face cases where we're adding data, so we're posting data and we want to test that, and we don't want to actually make that request to our server, which eventually will add it to our database if we are connecting it to the database. So instead, what we can do is mock HTTP requests. So we can basically tell Cypress, and this is actually true for any testing framework really, but we can tell Cypress that, hey, if this test eventually encounters this HTTP request, we want you to intercept it and return back this data. And the data that we return back is going to conform to the data that the server would usually send back, because again, we're mocking it. So let's actually go ahead and let's do that right now. So now what we're going to do is we're going to basically test the exact same thing, but this time we're going to mock the HTTP request. So let's add another it statement, and then here we should say it displays a list of rewards, but this time we're using a mock. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do here is we need to intercept the HTTP request. So remember, the HTTP request that is being made, so if I went to the network, so the HTTP request that is being made is to our server, which is HTTP localhost :4000/rewards. So we need to intercept this request. So let's actually go ahead and let's copy that and let's intercept it. Now, how do we intercept a request? Well, we use the sci.intercept command. And then over here, the first thing that we're going to do is specify what the method of this request is. So is it a get, or what the verb of this is. So is it a get request? Is it a delete request? Is it a post request? This is a get request. And then we're going to specify the URL that we want to intercept. So we're going to say that if you ever hit a get request that is making a request to this particular URL, we want you to intercept it and send back some data. And what that data is going to be inside of this, inside of the second parameter, right, or the third parameter right over here. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to say this object, and then we're going to say fixture, and then we're going to say rewards.json. Rewards.json. So what does this mean over here? Well, as you can see, we have this fixtures directory. And what this fixtures directory basically contains a bunch of JSON files that mock JSON data. That's really all it is at the end of the day. So what we can do is we can create a rewards.json. So we can create a rewards.json. And then we can go ahead and basically add some data in here. So let's actually go ahead over here and let's just copy. Let's copy some data. Let's actually copy. Let's copy these three. And I might have to do a little bit of. You know what? Let's actually go to my GitHub page. Let's go to final. This is just going to be a lot cleaner. We can go to client. We can go to Cypress, fixtures, rewards.json. We can just copy this data. So essentially what this is going to do is just, again, this is just some data that we're going to use to mock our HTTP requests. And essentially here we're saying that, hey, we want to use the fixture of JSON or rewards.json. So send me back this data right over here. And this is all that this is doing. So it's intercepting the GET request to this URL, and it's sending back this data. So we're actually not making a request to the client. We're just going to send back this data by intercepting it. And then ultimately what we can do is we can make the same exact assertion. So now at this point, we can pretty much ensure that, hey, we're getting back this data all the time, and this is going to be super fast because we're not going to make any HTTP requests. And if, you know, there's some actions like adding to the database or caching or whatever, we're going to skip that because we're intercepting it. So let's go ahead and save this. And now you can see it works perfectly fine. So the first one, you can see all of it, and this was because we made a request to the server. But here you can see, if I go here, you can see that it didn't work, which is strange. I was not expecting that actually. I was expecting to only see 3. And this didn't really work the way that I intended it. Oh, okay. That's because this is localhost 4,000, not 3,000. We intercepted the wrong URL. So let's go ahead, and you can see here now we only have 3. Okay, cool. So you can see that it actually intercepted it, and it used the data that we put inside of our awards.json. Okay, so that is really, really cool. So now let's actually just move on to the very last one. And the very last one is basically the accomplishments page. And this time we are making HTTP requests. So this is going to be something that's, so we still have our validation over here. And this is just a client-side validation. But we can also go ahead and we can go ahead and do this successfully. And this is going to make a post request to our API. And you can see that the message is we get accomplishment sent. Now, another thing that I added is maybe we want to have some sort of filtration. We don't want people to put any sort of word in there. We don't want anybody to put any word. Maybe we don't want people to put, cuss words or bad words. And I'm not going to go ahead and start typing some bad words. So what I did was inside of the server, I basically essentially said that, hey, if the title or the accomplishment includes a graph, and this is going to simulate a bad word, it's going to return a response of your content is not appropriate. And the client is going to take this response and it's basically going to showcase that error. So if I put graph in here, you can see here that it actually makes an HTTP request and it sends back your content is not appropriate. So this actually, again, is going to be a kind of a client-server model. And we could go ahead and basically test the client as well as the server. And let's actually go about doing that right now, or we can mock the response. So let's actually go ahead and let's just test the client and the server, and then we're gonna have another test where we mock the response. Okay, so let us go here. Let's add a what are we gonna call this? Well, we're gonna call this accomplishments.spec.js. And then let us add this. Let's add the describe block. So we have a describe block in here. And then this is gonna be the accomplishments dashboard. And then let's also have a before each, of course, because before each we're going to run this, and I'm missing some syntax here. Before each, we're gonna do accomplishments, and then we're gonna have an it block, and we're gonna say should display inappropriate content error when text or accomplishment includes graph, because this is an inappropriate word for our sake for some reason. Okay, so let us go here and let's do sci.get. Let's just get by the placeholder. So we're gonna get by the placeholder that is equal to title. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna just type in, let's just type in, this is my accomplishment. All right, so nothing with graph here, but then let's just say that for the text area, we have the placeholder, and then this is going to be my accomplishment. And then what we're going to do is we're going to type in here that my accomplishment is I pet a graph. So I petted a graph. That was my accomplishment. But we're including the bad word, which is graph. And then, of course, what we're going to have to do is also click on that checkbox. So let's do type of submit. So get the element with type of submit, and we're just gonna go ahead and quickly click on it. Cool. And then we're gonna do sci.get. We're gonna have to click on the button. Let's just get it by the element, and let's click on it. Again, this is probably not good practice, but whatever, just for a quick sake. So now, essentially, because this contains graph, we're going to basically expect that this content is visible. So now what we can say is sci.contains, and then we're gonna say that, hey, your content is not appropriate, and we're gonna say that this should, and this should be dot visible. So if I save this, and then we go back here, we go to the accomplishments page, and it seems like we didn't really click on the button itself. So type of checkbox. There we go. There we go. And it has worked. And you can see that it actually made a request, and you can see that, hey, this has returned back a 406. So this is really, really great. And this is testing, again, the client and the server. But again, what if we don't want to do this? What if, if we add this and this ends up saving to our database, and we eventually don't want to do that, or we end up caching it, or there's multiple reasons why we eventually really don't want our tests to be interacting with our server. We might want separate tests for that, but we don't want our actual tests to interact with our server and start making real HTTP requests. So instead, again, what we can do is mock this request. So we can basically save this. We can basically copy this, and we can just say that, hey, this time we want to do this with a mock. And then over here, similarly, what we can basically do is sci.intercept. So we can do sci.intercept. And then what we can basically do is we can say that this is a post request. And then we can say HTTP. And then we can say localhost 4000. And then, of course, then we're going to have our function. Now, we don't necessarily have to have a fixture in here. We could also have an arrow function that is basically going to perform some sort of logic. And the function is going to contain the request itself. And what we can potentially do here is do something like request.reply, and then this is going to reply with a response. So it's going to reply with a response. And the response is going to be, well, we can do res.send, and then the response is going to be of message, and then your content is not appropriate. So just to quickly clarify this, I believe I misspelled that. Let me just quickly copy this and paste it in here. Just to quickly clarify this, when you make a HTTP request, you get back this response over here with the message of your content is not appropriate. So what we could do is we could also add a handler here. Instead of a fixture, we can add a handler that's basically going to reply with this object right over here. Your content is not appropriate. So now if we go ahead and save this, we can actually go here, and you can see that this was actually intercepted. And just to prove this to you, I can say that your shirt is not appropriate for some reason. And you can see that that's exactly what's displayed. However, of course, the assertion is going to fail because that's not actually placed inside of our UI element. So let's just say content is not appropriate, and you can see that this actually intercepted the request. All right, I think that's pretty much it for this crash course. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I actually really enjoyed learning more about Cypress and teaching it as well. And it's something that I'm definitely going to be consistently using throughout all of my projects and applications. So stay tuned for the next one.